fluid, much more effective way of going about it. So, speaking of Zoom calls, it's kind of an interesting mind game. If Zoom was around in the first century AD, is this what it would look like? You know, here's our 11 leftover apostles, and I love Thomas down in the right bottom corner. I'm not going to believe it unless he turns on his camera. That's what
Mm.
that's the way I feel about Zoom calls now too. Is we're all showing up, and it's always going to be virtual. Reality is a different thing. The reality today that I want to talk about has to do with um, something that is very pertinent to all of us, but it's been pertinent to the world at large for a long time. What you see on the screen now are our church's two youngest saints. This is Francisco and his sister, Jacinta Marto, two of the children from Fatima. And there are some very poignant parts to their story. Within a few years after this photo was taken, they both died. Francisco was 10, almost 12, and Jacinta was almost 10. She died at 9 years of age. The two poignant parts I want you to keep in mind is that they both died during the Spanish flu pandemic, in a worldwide pandemic such as we're experiencing today. And it is providential. And I did not realize this until just a couple days ago. Today is their feast day in the church. So everything comes together for good with this as they're with their models. Now, a question I get often is this. I'm very involved, very active in this vaccine discussion. I've become more so over the past really 8, 9 months or so. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and orthopedic surgeons are usually not the go-to experts when it comes to immunology and infectious disease and all of that. Well, I'm also a husband, a father, a grandfather, and I really want to be as informed as I can. We all want to leave behind a better world than what we started with. And I assume there are people on this call that fall into the three categories I've gone through over the past 8 months about vaccines. And those categories that I see them are I went from being dubious, very skeptical, very suspicious, into a very confused state. And over the past 2 to 3 months, more confident about the information and what is true about this. And that's because through this whole process, as I've gotten more and more deeply involved in this topic, I've learned from incredibly bright, thoughtful, and quite frankly, very holy people, many of them colleagues in the CMA with me. Um, I've become involved. The Charlotte Lozier Institute, we'll talk about a little bit later. Many of you may be familiar with the Children of God for Life, which has been, for the past 15 years or so, probably one of the best, if not the best, resource for vaccine information. I've been involved with developing position papers with the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And one of the biggest blessings was being invited to join the bishop's task force on vaccines with some of the most intelligent and inspiring minds that I've ever been able to deal with. And
Got
most
it.
and most recently, there are other organizations that I've been involved with as a representative from the CMA that share the same um, principles based on our Christian faith. And so this is where I've moved through these phases from being dubious to confused to confident. And I'll try to point that process out as we go along. Just some basic information about how these vaccines are made. There really are four main ways to make a vaccine. The first is to simply weaken the virus. The virus is still minimally active, not so active to cause illness, but active enough to cause an immune system reaction. The second is to inactivate the virus. If you read or hear of a killed virus vaccine, that's what this is. And a third way is to use just a portion of the virus that's injected to produce the immune system reaction. But the one we want to focus on this morning is the fourth way, which is the new way, and that is using a portion of the genetic code of the virus. And the buzz term mRNA, messenger ribonucleic acid. We'll just call it mRNA. That's the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the new kid on the block. So, what is an mRNA vaccine? Messenger RNA is just what the word messenger means. It tells the cell what to do. It tells the cell, in this instance, to make a protein, part of the spike protein, the outer covering of the coronavirus, to trigger the immune response. And in very brief description, so the injection is done. The mRNA is enclosed in these little, what are called nanoparticles in the solution. It is injected into the muscle. The particles kind of fuse with the cell, the wall of the cell, the membrane of the cell. The mRNA then enters the matrix of the cell, not the nucleus of the cell. And then within the matrix of the cell, outside the nucleus, are small um, little organelles. They're called ribosomes. Ribosomes are kind of the interpreter for the message. They look at the messenger RNA and then they produce the protein. In this instance, the spike protein. That makes the cells start to produce these spike proteins on the outside. That is where the antibodies, that diagram, the little Y-shaped figures are the antibodies. That's what an mRNA vaccine does. There are important things that it doesn't do. It doesn't cause a viral infection. This is not a live virus, and it does not affect DNA of the cell. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, one of the things about the messenger RNA is adaptability for these vaccines. We've all heard, particularly in the past month to 6 weeks or so, oh my goodness, now we have all these variants. We start with the D614G out of the original Wuhan virus, and now all the variants are coming out and legitimately concerned. There seems to be a higher uh, infectious level in these. There does not, there may be a bit more severity of illness, particularly with the South African variant, but if the genetics of the variants are different enough from the original virus, that may compromise the vaccine effectiveness. Well, this is where the mRNA vaccines have an advantage. They're like a Swiss Army knife. You can change the genetic sequence in the vaccine, change the messenger RNA, and then the vaccine becomes effective against the variant. So it's a plug and play kind of system. And that's a very, very simplistic explanation, but it allows it to be more nimble, a quicker response to these variants. So the basic question that I started with back in the late spring, early summer of last year, what are the questions? Should I be worried? How worried should I be about these vaccines? I'm an old dog. This is a new trick, and that's the kind of stuff that worries me. So, like most of us, I was in that camp of these. This is too fast. I'd rather have quality than quickness. But why were they developed so fast? And if they were that quick, how could they be safe? Well, the usual steps for the vaccine testing and the review of the testing, when you hear about phase 3 studies, those were followed. The phase 3 trials were done over the same period of time with the same number of subjects that would be done for any previous vaccine, any in the past. The difference in this case that really speeds things up is the fast development of the vaccine. Once it's developed, then you go on to the trials. Why was it so fast? First off, the technology for these mRNA vaccines had been developed about a decade ago and was already in place. And frankly, it was like we have the ammunition, now we just need a target. This is what happened with the mRNA vaccines. There were lowered government barriers to this. We certainly, particularly in the US, we get a lot of complaints from doctors and researchers, et cetera, that the government keeps getting in the way, keeps throwing up obstacles. Well, those were lowered in this case. Very critically important here is this genetic sequencing. The genes in the spike protein, the genetic sequence, was identified very quickly back in December to January. And that was determined within a few days. If you go back 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, remember the genomic, the genome project, we're going to sequence the human genes and all. Doing this 5 years ago, 10 years ago would have taken weeks, months, maybe a year. But with the technology available now, the spike protein gene genetic sequence was determined very quickly. That cut down time considerably. Obviously, a tremendous amount of money thrown at this. Pfizer was the only one of the warp speed companies that did not take the government money, did not use the government money for this, but the finances fueled the project. And one thing that I think is very underestimated that speeds this along, the clinical trials of this, phase 3 trials, were done in the middle of a full blown pandemic, widespread disease. That allows not only a faster assessment of its effects, but also better and more sound data to support that. So, the other question, and this is something that was a big concern too with the genetic sequencing going with this, it will change my DNA. Well, there's some good reassurance about this. The DNA is inside the nucleus of the cell. mRNA is processed, decoded outside the nucleus in the ribosome that we looked at earlier. And as soon as that happens, the cell has a what I would call a garbage disposal system. It takes the mRNA after it's been transcribed and breaks it down, gets rid of it. So the effect on the DNA, there are some viruses, particularly the HIV virus. Some of the variants of that virus have the ability to reverse engineer this within the nucleus. There are no vaccines that do this, only that a very few viruses. When you get something in your body, you want to know what it is. You want to know what the components are. This was a concern that I had as well. What is in the vaccines? I'm thinking there are a lot of discussion. You can still find it online that, oh, there's things in that vaccine that they're sneaking in there. Well, remember that this is the approval for use of vaccines is no different than it is for medications or for the food we eat. That is why it is the Food and Drug Administration. And one of their requirements for approval is analysis of the ingredients and a listing of the ingredients. Just like on your box of cereal, the vaccines have a list of ingredients. In the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, there is a very small fragment of the mRNA that we talked about. There are no preservatives. That's why they require such a low temperature. You may have seen in the news the past couple of days, particularly out of Israel, it's being found that it does not have to be as low a temperature as was thought. It may be able to be maintained in conventional freezers. That's becoming a big topic to pay attention to. And importantly, these vaccines don't have any adjuvants. And what an adjuvant is something in the vaccine that increases the effectiveness of it. They don't have any, it'd be like putting food coloring in something to make it look better. An adjuvant would be something that makes it work better. And A lot of the stuff that it's still online too is that these injections include microchips or radio frequency transmitters. The mark of the beast is in there. I mean, all kinds of concerns about this. Well, the technical problem with it is none of these things would be small enough to fit through the needle used for the injection. And it certainly would expect to see it on the list of ingredients as well, and it is not. And importantly to our discussion today, and we'll come back to this in a minute, as far as there being anything in these vaccines that is a component of any other cells, particularly abortion-derived cells or tissue, is not there. Short-term risks. If you've had the vaccine, you're aware of this. If you know someone's had the vaccine, what to expect. This is one of those the pain is good kind of things. It's a good friend of mine in the CMA had a pretty profound reaction after his second injection, the second dose. And he was, as he described it, he said, I was incredibly happy to be that sick. That just means your immune system is doing its job. It's keeping up. It is activated and ready to go. Um, there are some episodes of what's known as anaphylaxis. That's a very severe reaction, allergic reaction to the vaccine. And just about 2 days ago, the CDC released the data now looks at somewhere about 4 or 5 people per million with an anaphylactic reaction. That reaction um, has been exclusively in people with a history of similar reactions. And these are the kind of people that have to carry an EpiPen with them, for example, if they have an allergy where they have to self-administer epinephrine. One of the highlights of this that I think is very helpful, the VAERS system. This is the HHS has this system. They have an app. If you get a vaccine, they have an app you can download on your phone, and you have direct access to them to report anything that seems out of the ordinary. So the data is piling up with this. Obviously, we're very early in this episode, but the data is going to be and they follow up on any reports that are sent by people who receive the vaccine. Now, I want to make a quick comment about this, about some of the I'll say misinformation or misleading information that is often in the press about this. And we have to be able to differentiate between, is it COVID or is it coincidence? Or often you'll hear the term correlation versus causation. And what it all comes down to is, if something happens, did it happen because of the vaccine, or would it have happened without the vaccine? And as an example of this hits close to home. This is a mid-career orthopedic surgeon in Memphis that early in February died. And if you read the headlines, this one's not as misleading as some of the others. Some of the online and newspaper headlines would say Memphis surgeon dies of COVID-associated MIS. Okay, you read the headlines, you read the first paragraph, you think, this is why I don't want to get a vaccine. Well, the backstory on this is he died of multi-system inflammatory syndrome, MIS, which is a medical entity. It's a multiple organ type of problem. It's been associated with COVID infections, particularly in younger individuals or the occasional kids, teenagers with this. While he was sick at the outset of it, he did have a positive antibody test, but he had never been symptomatic for anything related to a COVID-like illness before that. And he had been vaccinated, but the second dose used was several weeks before he died. So if you read that far into the story, it makes it sound all the way through through the majority of the story, this is a COVID vaccine related death. Well, God bless the family. The family went to the doctors in the hospital that took care of him, and they said, get the details out, get it out there, make sure the facts are out there. And in working with the CDC, This was just a very sad and tragic coincidence. He died of MIS. That's indisputable, but it was not related to COVID, nor was it related to the vaccine. There's no indication of any association with that. So keep that in mind. If you see these type of stories, read all the way down. You don't find this stuff about the family's request for this release until you get to the last couple paragraphs of a story like this. Now, obviously, a big topic, and in a minute I'll mention why this is a very important topic to our family as well. Pregnant women must be protected, whether by vaccine or by distancing and masking and all of the usual precautions we're familiar with. Because if a pregnant woman is infected, their risk of developing a more serious infection is higher. Um, it does the virus being infected while pregnant, the risk of miscarriage really is not increased. In fact, there's one relatively small study that the rate of miscarriage was lower than what would be expected, which is it wasn't enough data to really say that with great confidence. But there is a slight risk of preterm birth prior to 37 weeks of pregnancy. A slight risk there seems to be early on in the process, when mRNA vaccines were being trialed, there was a lot of discussion and still some discussion about the vaccines being harmful to placenta development. Syncytin 1 is a protein that's important for development of a normal placenta. The spike protein has some genetic similarities to it, but there is such a small portion of the gene for the spike protein that's used. There is no indication of any harm to the placenta, nor is there a great concern about that going forward. Now, breast milk, there's no evidence of transmission of the virus or problems with the vaccine in breast milk. There are specific studies now. Pregnant women were excluded from the phase 3 trials, but after those vaccines were given, a lot of women became pregnant, and there don't seem to be any issues with the pregnancy or the baby afterwards. So the CDC at this point in time does not recommend against being vaccinated for COVID during pregnancy. And in fact, historically, they have recommended and continue to recommend the flu vaccine, the Tdap, the tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis, whooping cough vaccine during pregnancy. From a personal perspective, um, I have a daughter who works in a hospital. She works in healthcare. At about 14 weeks into a pregnancy, she had the vaccine done. That was just about a month, 6 weeks ago. I'm happy she had it. If that discussion had happened 5, 6 months ago or more, I would have been extremely nervous and very, very hesitant. I have a daughter in law who also works in healthcare, who had her vaccine as she was breastfeeding. And similar with my daughter. If that had happened months ago, several months ago, I would have been really hesitant, very concerned about that. Now I'm not. So that's enough. That's about short term. Long term, okay, the long term effects. This is the easy question to answer because all you got to do is say, we don't know. And we have to put some limits on this too. How long? What is long? Right now, the first people to be vaccinated in the phase 3 trials was about 6 to 6.5 months ago. Well, that's long term follow up compared to somebody who got vaccinated this week. Well, are we talking a year, 5 years, 10 years? We honestly don't know. I'm not as worried about it as I was in the past, but you got to sometimes you got to know what you don't know. So in the long term, there's a balancing act that we need to consider here. Yes, we have to be concerned about the possibility of long-term adverse effects of receiving the vaccine. That's a very legitimate point. But balance that against the risk of having COVID and the term you hear is long haul COVID. And this is a graph of the symptoms that are commonly associated with COVID. And on the right side of the graph, where you see post COVID follow up, that goes out to 3 months afterwards. And you've got about half the people still feel fatigue, almost half still are short of breath. Now there is increasing concern about what's not just the pulmonary issues and the overall systemic symptoms. There's increasing evidence of what's come to be known as neuro COVID. The conventional term is brain fog, just unable to concentrate, unable to focus. And over the past 2 weeks or so, there have been some discussion in the literature about a almost a PTSD type problem in people that survive moderate or severe COVID infections. So if you if you look at the long-term effects of the vaccine versus the long-term effects of a COVID infection, it's a balancing act that you really have to give considerable thought to. The ethical concerns that go with this is where I want to steer away from the medical, clinical, the scientific side of this. Let's talk about what do we do, what is right in regards to our conscience. Now, the USCCB has good information and is really doing as much as they can in their Together in Christ effort about COVID-19. I would encourage you to look at their website for that. We do have a couple poster children for this. In early January, both current Pope and the emeritus Pope did receive the vaccine. I thought that kind of endorsement, particularly from Benedict, was very encouraging. But as we said at the outset, this comes down to a very, very important and unfortunately a discussion that should have been carried out decades ago, and that is the use of cell lines derived from abortions. Now, this is an alphabet soup type of list. There are multiple different types of abortion derived cell lines. And if you see in other slides an abbreviation that says ADCL or ADFCL, that stands for abortion derived fetal cell lines. The first two you see on the screen, HEK 293 and PER-C6, are far and away the most common abortion derived cell lines that have been in use. These four cell lines you see here, these abbreviations, are each of them is from a single abortion that took place as far back as the 60s, as recently as the 80s. The term immortalized is used for these. I don't like that term, but it's actually fairly descriptive. These cells were harvested, they were put into culture, they were grown, and they would reproduce like cells do if they are provided the proper environment and the proper nutrients. So these cells have just continued and continued and continued for the past 30, 40, 50 years or so. And they have become, particularly the first two, they have become the standard cells for research in biology, in medicine, et cetera. And when it comes to vaccines, it's a very straightforward, quite simple process. When the vaccines are developed, there is design, research, and development. That's the first stage. Goes on to the production stage. And during the production stage, there are confirmatory tests that can be done, that are often done to make sure the product is up to snuff. And it's not just a one-time test. It's just like you got quality assurance in a place that's making bologna. They're going to take out every occasional package of bologna to make sure it's looks and tastes and it is what it's supposed to be. Well, in Pfizer and Moderna's case, the only time they use abortion derived cells is during these quality control tests, these lab tests. They're using them, yes, but it is not exceptionally frequent. In contrast, the AstraZeneca and Johnson and Johnson vaccines, which will be the next one or two to come up for emergency approval, they use these cells in all stages. So if you look at this as an ethical hierarchy, Pfizer and Moderna are certainly preferable to AstraZeneca and J&J. And an important factor in all of this is that these don't, the use of these cells does not produce a demand for new cells or tissue. Now, don't get me wrong, that does not mean that there are not abortions ongoing. That does not mean that there are not abortions that are done and cells or tissue are harvested. We know that goes on. But when it comes to specifically for these vaccines, there is no demand for the vaccine companies don't have to wait for another abortion to take place, continue doing their work. They have these immortalized cell lines. And this is one of the saddest things to me about all this. If you really drill down and look at how much our society is, this is ingrained, the use of these abortion derived cell lines. Almost almost all vaccines that are on the market in the US that are used in the US have an association with abortion. It is almost impossible to find any medication, whether it's prescription or over the counter. If you put in a name of a medication and you put in HEK 293, you Google that, you're going to find something where they use it during quality control, production testing, whatever it may be. And in so many of our processed foods, the same thing. And I mean, how do you, if you really want to be scrupulous about this, how do you avoid it? Well, you become a subsistence farmer and you make your own tools and you don't use your cell phone. It's just, it is essentially impossible to avoid this. However, that does not mean that it shouldn't be attended to. And we'll come back to that as well. So let's get specifics about the church's position on these cells and vaccines. There actually is a pretty straightforward and considerable depth in the church's positions over the past, particularly over the past 15, 20 years, but even going back to the 80s, and mostly from the Vatican offices, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the Pontifical Academy for Life. Back to 1987, Donum Vitae from the CDF. A letter, there's a backstory to this letter in 2005 that is just a beautiful story, but we won't go into great detail now for the sake of time. Dignitas Personae from CDF talked about this, particularly in regards to the dignity of the unborn. In 2017, this was a note that was really intended from the Pontifical Academy for Life to the Italian medical community, but it's pertinent to what we're talking about today. And most recently, and most importantly in regards to COVID, was this note that the CDF released just before Christmas. And one term that comes up in all of this is an ethical term called cooperation with evil. I mean, it sounds bad, and yeah, it can be bad. Now, if you really want information about this, this is a graduate level philosophy course that would take a couple of semesters. If you can boil it down to one, I won't even say simple chart, but one chart. The top of the chart is cooperation. You're working with another individual. There is an act being carried out, and there is an object of the act. Well, you don't want to be on the left side of that screen. Anything that has the bold rectangle, the bold black line around it, that's where you don't want to be. That is where you are directly involved. You are explicitly, at worst, explicitly cooperating with evil. You want to be at the bottom right-hand corner. And if you hear the term remote cooperation with evil, that's where we are when it comes to the use of these vaccines and their association with abortion-derived cells. Another term that's come into use with this that I think is, I think it's a good term, but the term appropriation and a basic definition of appropriation in this discussion is you gain benefit because of an evil in the past, something that was done in the past that was not good, but it has led to benefit now. And that is true when we look at these COVID vaccines. It was an evil act that led to the development of the abortion derived cell lines. But we are benefiting from that now. However, there are some criteria about appropriation that need to be considered and avoided. One is ratification. If you approve, if you think that that evil was carried out in the past is okay, then you have an unethical opinion of it. You want to, if there's a corruption of character, meaning that you are desensitized to that evil. If you find yourself thinking, well, there's abortion cells are used for everything from vaccines to medicine to the hamburger I'm eating, all of that stuff, if you're becoming complacent about it, that is not appropriate from a moral perspective. And third, the very common term in the church of scandal. Will your acceptance of this be seen as your ratification of it? You don't want that would be an instance of scandal. And there are some historical examples we can use for this. The most blatant one, the most commonly discussed one is what about the medical information, the research that was done by Nazi physicians and Nazi scientists? For example, chloroquine, which is a component of what we've all heard of hydroxychloroquine. Chloroquine was developed by Nazi researchers, Nazi scientists. Um, when you treat frostbite nowadays, the technique used is called rapid rewarming. That was that came from experiments that Nazi physicians did on prisoners in the concentration camps, and the prisoners did not survive. They were trying to learn how to treat frostbite and experimenting on human beings. So, do we throw that out? It is a past evil, to be sure, but can we benefit from that information? Yes, it's an uncomfortable reassurance. I will admit, I don't like that idea either. And a more, um, maybe current, more recent is organs being transplanted, and but the donor is a homicide victim. It was an evil act that led to a benefit. And that is, it's an unusual situation, but there have been cases of this. And yes, there are some ethical concerns about that. But the benefit versus the evil is the point of comparison. So, the ultimate question, do you get a vaccine or not? As a Catholic, as a committed, faithful Catholic Christian, do you get a vaccine? Is it morally acceptable to receive these vaccines? Set the science and the medical stuff aside from an ethical and conscience rights perspective. Is it acceptable? This is where the note from the CDF just before Christmas came out. If ethically irreproachable vaccines are not available, if the ethically pure vaccines are not available, it is indeed morally acceptable to use these vaccines. It goes on also to say that just the fact that you do this does not mean you are cooperating with the abortion, cooperation with evil, as we just talked about. And this is another one of the pillars of Catholic social teaching that comes into play is the common good. You getting an injection, getting a vaccine can protect others. Love God, love your neighbor. That is what the common good is all about. So, the 2 points of this discussion, accepting a vaccine or accepting the use, meaning accepting the use of abortion derived cells, those are not the same thing. You can accept the vaccine and still be opposed to the use of these cells. And I hesitated to put this slide in there, but it is it is an honest slide. This is the part of this discussion, particularly from the church's standpoint, that has really, if I could just pull out only my gray hair, I'd pull out the gray hair, but I pull out all my hair. I get so frustrated and sometimes discouraged because of the information that is very often not just confusing, but conflicting. In that statement just before Christmas, vaccination is not, as a rule, a moral obligation, is not a moral obligation. You are not obligated to be vaccinated. as far as church doctrine is concerned. Well, 3 weeks later, Pope Francis does a interview with a TV news program in Italy, and this is his quote: "I believe that morally everyone must take the vaccine." Now, fortunately, this was not a, uh, a papal proclamation, so it doesn't really hold that much weight. But that's the stuff that just makes me look sideways at things. I just uh, I've come to the conclusion that yes, indeed, we are a universal church, but clearly never have been and never will be a unanimous church. But now I want to get into where do we go from here? And I think that is the most important discussion that we need to be having now and in the future. We've It's far too late for us to be addressing this issue as when it comes to the use of abortion derived cells and tissues. How do we correct this? Well, this is where I've got to give credit where credit is due to the voices in the Vatican that are ready for this. Even back in 2005, it is up to the faithful. We're the ones that have to oppose this. We need to put pressure on the authorities, the people in leadership in the various arenas, so that this can be changed. We knew opposed by all means. We'll come back to that in just a minute as well. And my favorite statement, and I would be very surprised if this phrase has been used in any other Vatican document, any other church document over 2,000 years. Make life difficult for the pharmaceutical industries. That to me is, I think that is the heart of where we go forward with this. We'll come back to that as well. And then finally, in the Pontifical Academy for Life, they just reiterate that using these is morally licit, but that does not mean you accept the practice of abortion. And so I think we're in kind of a St. Michael moment right now. I think we need to take advantage of this moment with our opposition to this. And so that's what we could do in general. But what about each of us individually? This, I've thought about this a lot, and I really think the key is not to focus on our politicians. They're interested in their next election. They're not interested in getting into the details of this. We can ask our bishops and our priests and all the church leaders to do the heavy lifting. They're spread so thin, and it needs to be a much bigger voice. We need to focus on the manufacturers. And what we need to focus on is what they focus on, and that's their bottom line. What they don't want, we see this all the time now in cancel culture. If you follow the My Pillow story, the Mike Lindell story, he's a Trump supporter, and sure enough, he's been taken off all social media. A number of the stores have stopped carrying his company's products because he's a Trump supporter. He's a strong Christian Trump supporter. So focusing on the bottom line is where I think that's going to be the most effective way to move this discussion along. First thing we got to do is raise our expectations, not just demand, but expect change. These companies need to know about this opposition. We need to organize people around us in our home, in our neighborhood, in our parish, in our diocese, in our associations, our groups that we're in. You need to tell your care providers and your hospitals, the health systems, this is what I want, this is what I expect, and if I can't get it from you, I'm going somewhere else. You need to support the ones who do some ethical work. There are places, and there are some very close to our heart here in the Midwest, places that do this kind of work. And you've got to stay on task with this, because this is the time. This is the time. I look at this as comparable to the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. That was a bottom up type of process that started at the grassroots level. And there needs to be the leadership at various levels, particularly manufacturers, they need to start to squirm. They need to be uncomfortable to the point where if they don't change, they're going to be more uncomfortable. A letter of protest. This is the simplest way to go about it. And for example, well, not for example, but if you want a letter that you can send, I have templated letters. One is if I had a vaccine, but I'm going to protest getting it. Or the other is I haven't got a vaccine, but I'm going to protest it before I even get it. You email the guild at the email on your screen, and I will send those files to you. There's the pre vaccine letter, a post vaccine letter. There's also a list of addresses for the pharmaceutical companies, the warp speed pharmaceutical companies. And what you see on the screen are excerpts from those letters. It's a one-page letter. All you got to do is fill in the blanks, whether you want to put your name in there, you sign it, whether you want to print it and mail it, whether you want to email it. But you just think about this. In the US, there are estimated to be 70,000 people or 70 million people who identify as Catholic. If 10% of Catholics, could you imagine what 7 million letters would look like going into these corporate offices? I think it's a hammer that we underestimate the power. So let's start winding down here. Um, I got to throw some good news out there because we all know how the story is going to end. The Gospels tell us that, but there's good news in this regard when it comes to the vaccines as well. Um, there are a couple others in the pipeline. The Novavax vaccine, it is it's going to be similar as far as abortion cell line usage to Moderna and Pfizer. Sanofi, GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, they have as it stands now, their data does not seem to show any association with these cell lines. However, early in the process, Pfizer, uh, during their phase 3 trials, there was no indication. Well, we ultimately discovered, yes, they use it for testing. So those cells, we've got to wait for the final answer on that. So when it comes to the vaccines we have now, compared to vaccines in the past for other diseases, other infections, are they better? Yes. Are they good enough? Oh, heck no. We got work to do. And there are centers that use fully ethical cell lines from adult stem cells or cells from umbilical cords or placentas. And the best example of this is just down the road in Iowa City, Coralville, the John Paul II Medical Research Institute. Dr. Alan Moy and his team there have been doing this work for 15 years. They are committed to this. They need prayer, they need support, they need particularly financial support. They are a small player right now, but if we can get places like this to pick up steam and get the tools and the financing that they need, this is the game changer. If, because they can show evidence that they can develop them quickly, they can develop them effectively, they can develop them efficiently and safely, and not use unethical cells and tissue. So, yeah, there's progress, but we can't rest until we get to perfect for this. So, in closing, I want to give you a couple examples here of people to model what we need to be doing. Uh, One of my all-time favorites, and not just because I'm in his parish, his named parish here. This is St. Paul. And St. Paul the Apostle, he displayed one of the character traits that we have to have in this type of an endeavor. His travels during the 32 years from his conversion to his martyrdom, if you take away the time that he was at sea, on foot, he traveled 10,000 miles just on foot. So 10,000 miles is evidence of persistence. We've got to be persistent. We've got to be uh, in the parable of the lady who keeps bugging the judge, and he finally gives her what she wants just so she'll leave him alone. That's where we have to be the squeaky wheel in all of this. And one of my other favorite role models, because she says it straight, says it honest. Sweetheart, it's a requirement. This is not negotiable. We can't be wimpy about this. We've got to be loud. We've got to be clear. We've got to be demanding, and keep this issue front and center. There's no better time. This is the opportunity I believe that God has given us to really truly do the right thing. So, if there are 5 resources that I would encourage you to become acquainted with, and these 5 resources, you'll see I noted them at the beginning. The NCBC has very, very intelligent people and very, very thoughtful statements in all of this. The Charlotte Lozier Institute, David Prentice is a molecular biologist, PhD, that works there, who is, when I talk with David about these issues, I tell him that he's my Yoda and I'm his Skywalker. He has been leading me along through this whole endeavor, and he's a very good teacher. Children of God for Life, both of those. Lozier, particularly, they have a very nice online chart for all of the COVID vaccines that are in development and their association with abortion-derived cells. Children of God for Life has a chart for every vaccine that's available. If you go to that, you will find the ones that are that are fully ethical. You'll find ones that have ethical alternatives. Very good information there. The John Paul II Institute in Iowa City, go to their website, get to know what they do. I'm sure if you wanted to go take a tour, I've been over there a couple of times to do that, and they are very, very, very accommodating and very interested in our interest for them. And the shameless CMA plug, some of my friends in the CMA, this is an exceptionally good podcast, typically weekly, the Doctor podcast, and about half of their podcasts over the past 4 months to 5 months have been focused on COVID. And you will get not only the medical and scientific information you need, you'll also get the ethical, the moral, the Catholic perspective on these vaccines. So in closing, before we go to questions here, one of my, I think the greatest 20th century source for really good quotes in my mind is Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, GK. We don't want to just move the world. We don't want to move with the world. We want to will, and we will move the world. So until the time, and hopefully it's much, I pray it's much more sooner rather than later, we can be in the sacraments, we can be in mass together, and instead of pews apart, we can be shoulder to shoulder, and we can be grateful for the change that happens because of this kind of effort that we've got to keep going forward. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention. I went about maybe 8 or 10 minutes longer than I thought I would. I will be happy to take questions.